The Odyssey is one of the most influential stories ever told. There's a small problem though. There really isn't one definitive version of it. For centuries, the story existed as an oral tradition passed from one storyteller to another before scholars eventually put all the pieces together and standardized the version we know today. That gives Christopher Nolan something very unusual in these big projects: freedom. Not the freedom to rewrite the story, but the freedom to make his own interpretation of it. And that's exactly what he's done. On paper, almost every major event from Homer's poem is still there, from the Cyclops to the Sirens and beyond. Most of it is present. Even the gods are here, just as they are in the poem. But look a little bit closer and you'll realize something. Almost every one of those big moments means something different, because Christopher Nolan isn't really interested in making a fantasy with monsters. He's interested in asking what this story would look like if it happened to a real man returning from an unimaginable war. And by changing what the Odyssey is really about, Nolan may have created one of the boldest interpretations of a classic work of literature we've seen in years. Fair warning before we continue though, this video is absolutely full of spoilers for both Homer's poem and Christopher Nolan's film. So if you haven't seen the film yet, or rather stay spoiler free, go and watch my review first and then come back and watch this. Right, let's start with something that surprised me. Despite all the discussions online about how much Nolan changed, he actually changed far less than I expected, well, at least on the surface. If you strip everything back to its simplest form, Christopher Nolan tells almost exactly the same story as Homer does. Odysseus is trying to return home after the Trojan War. Telemachus is searching for his father. Penelope is holding Ithaca together while refusing to give up hope, and almost every major stop on Odysseus' journey appears somewhere in the film. So structurally, Nolan is actually very faithful. Even the way the story is told feels like a Homeric way of telling the story. One thing that's easy to forget is that the poem Odyssey isn't written as one continuous adventure. The poem jumps backwards and forwards through time with different characters recounting different parts of Odysseus' journey through stories and songs and memories before everything eventually coming together in Ithaca. That made perfect sense in the ancient world where there was no newspapers or television or internet back then, so stories only survived because people told them. And Nolan keeps the same idea alive. Rather than presenting everything chronologically, he moves between Telemachus searching for his father and Odysseus struggling to get home, and slowly allowing both timelines to meet. The biggest addition, though, is the fall of Troy itself and the scene with the horse. Because in Homer's poem, Homer never gives us a detailed description of the Trojan horse inside the Odyssey, or the fall of Troy. Different characters mention it, but the famous story mostly survives through later works that are not even Homer's. Nolan decides to show it, and I think that's one of the smartest decisions he makes. Because yes, it's obviously an incredible spectacle. It's tense and it's brutal. It's exactly the kind of large-scale, grand filmmaking that we've come to expect from Christopher Nolan. But it also serves another purpose. Everything that happens inside Troy becomes the emotional foundation for the rest of the film. Without those scenes, Nolan's interpretation simply doesn't work. The rest of the familiar episodes are still here too, with all the gods and monsters we're expecting to see, and at first glance they feel like faithful recreations of Homer's poem. But some scenes even play out almost exactly as you'd expect, but only on the surface, because I don't think Nolan is asking us to watch these moments as literal mythology. I think he's using mythology as a language that allows us to see the psychological state of a commander who has returned from war carrying more than just his men. What I think we're really watching here isn't a fantasy adventure, it's the story of a broken man trying to lead a group of equally broken men home. And once I started looking at the film through that lens, everything is surprisingly different and pleasantly fresh. One of the biggest changes Nolan makes isn't to the story, it's to Odysseus himself. In Homer's poem, Odysseus is famous long before he returns to Ithaca. He's the king of Ithaca, but more importantly, he's the clever one, the strategist, the man whose intelligence wins battles that strength alone never could. His greatest weapon isn't his sword, it's his mind. That's why the Trojan horse becomes so important. It's the greatest military deception in Greek mythology, and it was Odysseus' idea. Throughout the poem, that intelligence is constantly reinforced. Athena favors him above almost everyone else. She advises him, protects him, and in many cases intervenes directly to help him. The gods don't just watch Odysseus' journey, they actively shape it. So Nolan keeps the intelligence. His Odysseus is still calculating and is still capable of seeing solutions that nobody else can. But he changes something much more fundamental. This isn't a victorious king coming home. This is a commander trying to survive what victory has done to him. The Trojan horse sequence completely changes the way we look at everything that follows, because Nolan doesn't present it as a glorious triumph. He presents it as the moment Odysseus abandons every principle that once defined him. Think about it. Instead of meeting his enemy in open battle, he uses a symbol of peace to deceive them. Instead of honorable combat, he orders assassinations in the dead of night. He sneaks around and kills people. And instead of witnessing victory, he watches a civilization burn. In the Troy massacre, the victims are not only men, but women and children too, all slaughtered as the city around it, with its traditions and culture, burns to the ground. By the time he leaves the city, he hasn't simply won the war, he's become a totally different man. And I think that's key to Nolan's entire interpretation. The journey home isn't really about getting back to Ithaca, it's about whether someone who has experienced that kind of war can ever truly leave it behind. Which brings me nicely to the monsters. Now, this is where I think Nolan's interpretation becomes fascinating. The monsters are absolutely real within the world of the film. The Cyclops exists and we see it. Scylla exists and we see some of it. Circe exists. The sirens we see too. I'm not suggesting that this is imagining the entire journey, but I do think Nolan uses mythology as a way of visualizing something much deeper. Every monster, I believe, represents another psychological challenge that Odysseus has to overcome before he can finally return home. So let's take Cyclops, for example. In the book, in the poem, it's a story about intelligence overcoming brute force. Nolan keeps that, but he also turns it into something else. The Cyclops becomes chaos and fear, the impossible pressure of making decisions when every choice costs lives. Then there's Scylla and Charybdis. In the poem, Odysseus has to choose between losing 6 men or losing everyone. It's already one of the greatest moral dilemmas in literature. Nolan makes it even more uncomfortable. Instead of carrying that burden himself of making that decision, Odysseus tricks Eurylochus, his first mate, into making the decision. It's a brilliant little change because it tells us something about Odysseus that Homer never does. Odysseus is beginning to fear responsibility itself. Not because he's weak, but because he's exhausted by it, because every decision means more death, every choice leaves another scar. And then we arrive at Circe. Honestly, I think this might be the most revealing sequence in the entire film. Besides the fact that Samantha Morton plays her without no theatricality, there's no over-the-top magic or some exaggerated fantasy. Just an unsettling calm that somehow makes the whole encounter even more disturbing. The transformation of the soldiers, geez, that was genuinely horrifying. The body horror reminded me of The Substance, and it's not even the sequence, not even that much on the screen, just glimpses of what is happening to the men. But if you listen carefully to what Circe actually says when Odysseus forces her to change them back, she doesn't say she's turning pigs back into men. She says, "Return to your disguises." That line completely changed the way I looked at the film, because if becoming human is only another disguise, then perhaps they were already pigs. They were already greedy and violent and driven by conquest and reduced by years of war into something less than human. And if that's true, then Odysseus isn't so different either. Maybe that's what the monsters really are. Not literal obstacles on the journey home, but different ways of confronting the psychological damage left by the war. Everything that the war leaves behind in a soldier may be represented by a monster here. The fear, the guilt, the temptation to forget, the burden of command, the gradual loss of humanity. Viewed through that lens, this film stops feeling like a series of disconnected adventures, and instead, every encounter becomes another step in the same internal journey. And once you start looking at the film that way, there's one important character that suddenly makes sense far more than anyone else, and that's Athena. But before we get to her, there's another idea running quietly through the film, one that doesn't exist in Homer's poem at all, and that is the sea people. During the film, characters keep referring to these sea people almost as if they're a force of nature, a civilization that respects neither the laws of man nor the laws of the gods, and there's a mystery that surrounds them. But they are building a ruthless reputation. They don't negotiate, they don't honor hospitality, they don't recognize kings, they simply arrive and take everything by force. Penelope fears them, entire villages fear them, even Circe mistakes Odysseus and his men for them. At first, it feels like Nolan is just simply creating another threat to raise the stakes, but I think what he's doing is take the sea people as an idea, a symbol of a world that is changing. The old world is built on honor, on oaths, on loyalty and hospitality, on the belief that even enemies obey certain rules. That's the world Homer writes about. It's also the world that is essentially destroyed at Troy. Remember that Troy doesn't fall through courage, it falls through deception, where a gift becomes a weapon and the victory becomes a massacre. So the old rules already no longer matter, and the world that emerges afterwards is very, very different. This time, strength replaces honor, fear replaces respect, and conquest replaces diplomacy. It's a totally new age. And the irony is that Odysseus spends the entire film fearing that the sea people will destroy civilization, only to slowly realize that him and his own men have already become them. Think about it, how they behave on their journey home. They raid settlements, they threaten strangers, they demand supplies, they leave destruction behind them. And to Odysseus, they're returning as victorious heroes. To everyone they meet, they're invaders and they're monsters. And that's why Circe fears them and villages close their gates. That's why nobody welcomes them anymore. The greatest enemy Odysseus encounters isn't waiting across the sea, it's already aboard his own ship. And I think Nolan makes that painfully clear through this one character we've been hinting at, which is Athena. Now, in Homer's poem, Athena is Odysseus' greatest ally, advising him and protecting him, even disguising him when necessary. She's the voice guiding him home. But Nolan's Athena couldn't be more different, or perhaps she isn't Athena at all. Look, this is probably the biggest leap I'm taking in my interpretation of the film, so take it for what it is. I don't think we're actually watching the goddess Athena. I think we're watching Odysseus' memory of one of Troy's victims, a young woman murdered by his own army during the sack of the city. Throughout the film, she appears whenever Odysseus is forced to confront another impossible decision. But unlike Homer's Athena, she never tells him what to do. She never advises him. She always asks questions about guilt, about responsibility, about fear and pain, and the consequences of his actions. She doesn't feel like a protector. She behaves as if she's his conscience. Looking at her that way makes every one of her appearances feel different. They're no longer divine, but psychological. The war hasn't just followed Odysseus home, it has become part of him. Sometimes what's missing from a story tells us more than what's been added. One of the defining features of Homer's poem is the constant involvement of the gods, with Poseidon punishing Odysseus, Athena protecting him, Zeus ordering and intervening in the events. Basically, divine force shapes almost every important event. Human beings still make choices, but those choices exist inside a world governed by fate, governed by the gods. Nolan quietly removes all of that. The gods never truly intervene. You don't see any miraculous rescues or supernatural transformations. There's no obvious display of divine power. Even moments that appear magical at first can be explained in entirely human terms. For example, Calypso doesn't enchant Odysseus. She nurses him, treats his wounds, uses lotus flowers to dull his pain, and in the process she falls in love with him and wants him to stay. The poem has Zeus ordering her to release him. The film leaves us with something much simpler. She lets him go because she realizes what they have is unsustainable even after all her efforts to heal Odysseus. The same thing happens throughout the film. Every time we're tempted to see divine intervention, Nolan offers a human explanation instead, and I don't think that's accidental. In Homer, suffering often comes from the gods. In Nolan, it comes from ourselves. We create our own curses, make impossible choices, and carry the consequences. When I think of other films of Nolan, that idea is almost in all of them. The greatest conflicts in great films like Oppenheimer and Dark Knight and Interstellar aren't caused by magic or an external event. They're caused by humans making decisions, people acting with good intentions, making terrible mistakes, and having to live with consequences they can never escape. And I think Nolan sees the Odyssey in exactly the same way. Not as a battle between men and gods, but as a story about what happens when ordinary people survive extraordinary violence. Once the gods step aside, there's nobody left to blame but ourselves. I remember when I walked out of the cinema, I couldn't stop thinking about one question. Why change a story that has survived for nearly 3,000 years? If the Odyssey is already one of the greatest stories ever told, why reinterpret it at all? The answer is pretty simple. Christopher Nolan isn't trying to replace Homer, he's trying to translate him. Because I think every generation tells the same stories differently. Obviously not because the originals are broken, but because every generation is preoccupied with different things. To Homer, the Odyssey is a story about a hero trying to get home. To Nolan, it's the story of a soldier trying to become human again. The film doesn't use monsters in quite the same way Homer does. In the poem, there are obstacles on Odysseus' journey home. In Nolan's interpretation, they become expressions of the psychological burdens he carries within him. The fear, the guilt, the responsibility, the impossible weight of command. Those are the monsters, and they are still obstacles, it's just their meaning has changed. This is what great adaptations do. They don't simply recreate the source material scene for scene, they create almost like a conversation with the original material. Think of Peter Jackson doing The Lord of the Rings, or Denis Villeneuve with Dune, now Christopher Nolan with the Odyssey. And that's the beauty of adapting stories like this. The greatest myths don't survive because every generation tells them the same way. They survive because every generation discovers something new inside them. Maybe that's what Nolan's The Odyssey is really about. Not whether Odysseus can find his way home, but whether a man who has witnessed the horrors of war can ever truly return to the life he left behind. Because Ithaca hasn't changed, but Odysseus has. That's my take on Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey, but I'm really interested to hear what you think. Do you think Nolan's changes make the Odyssey more relevant to a modern audience, or do you prefer Homer's original interpretation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe, because I love making these deeper dives into the films just as much as I enjoy reviewing them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.